how the world is unknowable. We were just agreeing that one of the few predictable things in life is that I'll be late turning up to something. So many apologies for that. I've known Stephen for more than 35 years.
I think it was 1986 when we first met.
Well, yeah. It was, yeah.
We were grown-ups then as well, believe it or not.
So, and the thing about Stephen that struck me even then was that, you know, his kind of wit and erudition shone through even then in an institution that, let's be honest, isn't full of people with those qualities. So, and he's brought those, I think, to his books throughout his career, which is wonderful. Stephen, as Stephen mentioned, has been, of course, has had a distinguished career as chief economist at HSBC. Latterly, as I think a public intellectual and author of some important books. I think a common theme of all those publications is that Stephen brings a wide range of knowledge, if you like, to bear on any subject he talks about. So he delves into history, he uses political economy, social psychology, all of those disciplines, as well as the sort of drier academic stuff that we tend to be used to. And there's a lot of that in this book, and I think it's really important for that.
Academic stuff or the other stuff?
Sorry, the former, not the latter.
Yeah.
There's a bit of the former.
There is a bit of
Cool. Okay, well, without further ado, let's dive straight in. So, Stephen, the book's titled "We Need to Talk About Inflation." My first question is, why? And won't you look silly this time next year if, as some on the Bank of England's committee suggests, we will be running below the inflation target in 12 months' time?
Well, I might look silly tomorrow morning, depending on what the release is tomorrow morning. But I think it's fair to say that, you know, what we've experienced over the last 2 or 3 years is something which is fundamentally different from any of the forecasts that were around 2 or 3 years ago. And I think it's important to stress how much of a surprise this has been. Now, of course, there's a separate debate as to what's caused all this. And you know, you have the sort of what I describe as the excuses model. That's just a series of moments of bad luck that has led to this significantly higher rate of inflation. But what I argue in the book is that, yes, it's true that bad luck has been involved, but also I think that there was a sort of public policy problem, which is that policymakers couldn't even imagine a world where inflation might return. It was almost as though it just wouldn't happen, it couldn't happen, because we were embedded in the world of disinflation and of deflationary risk. And so when inflation comes along, it is very, very easy to say, we'll just dismiss it. It's just a series of unfortunate events. But if you sort of take a timeline that begins, I suppose, in very, very early 21, I think you can go through that timeline and think about the ways in which the inflation debate has moved on from where it sort of began. So at the beginning of 2021, when I became quite worried about inflation, you know, banks published these various surprise indices, trying to work out whether, you know, activity numbers or inflation numbers are surprising on the upside or the downside relative to consensus. And in early 2021, the US inflation numbers began to surprise on the upside, which in one sense was genuinely surprising given the decline, the collapse in economic activity that had taken place during lockdowns through the course of 2020. So here you have a situation where activity is very depressed and inflation begins to surprise on the upside. The initial explanation for this, which lasts about 6 weeks, is that this reflects the Biden fiscal stimulus because it's not happening elsewhere in the world, and therefore we don't have to worry about it. But 6 weeks later, you know, these surprise indices are not just surprising on the upside in the US, they're also surprising on the upside in the Eurozone and the UK. So within a very short space of time, you're seeing a momentum for inflation coming through on both sides of the North Atlantic. And then you go through the excuses phase, which is its semiconductors, its secondhand car prices, and so on. But then as 21 progresses, you discover that more and more goods prices are rising. And importantly, I think there's something that's often overlooked. Very few goods prices are now falling. Because in the previous period, the period of very, very low inflation, it was a mixture of prices going up and prices going down. But at this point, you've got basically virtually all prices going up, some fast, some slow, but the general picture is one of rising goods prices. And then towards the end of 2021, when people are beginning to say, well, this is going to unwind, you begin to see the first signs of service sector inflation moving higher too. And then you end up with Putin invading Ukraine, which in one sense is rather convenient for central banks. I'm not suggesting they thought in precisely these terms, that would be unfair. But it's convenient in the sense it provides another explanation for why inflation is moving higher. Now, it's entirely fair to say that inflation is obviously a lot higher than it would have been in the absence of the invasion of Ukraine and the energy food price shocks that come through subsequently. But nevertheless, I would suggest that the inflation momentum on either side of the Atlantic was established before the invasion of Ukraine. And then as we went through 2022, I think you're beginning to see quite clearly second round effects coming through, which the Bank of England, I think, might have admitted to last week. But there wasn't much of an acceptance, I think, that these things could happen. So my view, I suppose, is that you had this bias in thinking, which was very much the idea that deflation was the only game in town. That if inflation were to appear only in terms of temporary factors and nothing else, there's nothing to worry about. And yet here we are, 2 or 3 years into the story, and inflation is way higher than people had anticipated. And even if it falls, which most people expect, later this year, and I'm sure it will fall over the next few months, I think it's not clear to me that there's a full conviction that it's going to go back to 2% and stay there, which is effectively what the sort of consensus has tended to
and the markets are pricing,
and the markets are pricing it as well. And just one final thing, I suppose, on this, which is that the Bank of England's projections of inflation dropping to 2 or below. I mean, the one thing, actually, the two things you can observe which are always right. The first is Shamik, you're always late, and the second is that the Bank of England always forecasts that inflation is back to 2% or below in 2 years' time. And these are sort of guarantees, certainties in the world. But of course, the problem here is that you're a central bank. You have an inflation target. You've told people that your monetary policy works with a sort of lag of 18 months or 2 years. So if you're forecasting in 2 years' time that inflation will be anything other than 2%, it immediately raises the question, why haven't you changed policy now to give you the right result in 2 years' time? So you've got, I think, a fundamental, almost like an intellectual problem in terms of how central banks think about the future, because they're compelled, I would say, to come out with what is the right number, irrespective of what is happening today.
Can I explore that a bit further? Because I think that's really, first of all, I should say there's lots of fascinating history in the book, and I want to touch on that shortly. But let's stick with the current inflationary episode just for a moment. What is it about, why do you think, I mean, there's lots of clever people on, in the FOMC and the ECB Governing Council and the Monetary Policy Committee. What is it about? Is it about the institution, the institutional design, or is it something about the mindset that led them to maybe misdiagnose what's going on, as we came out of the pandemic? Is that a fair description of what?
So there are a couple of pages in the book which look at things like corporate governance and groupthink and stuff like that. Possibly some of the more controversial pages in the book. So
we get to those early.
The first thing I would note is that if you look at the amount of dissent on either the FOMC or the MPC, there's a sort of gradual trend away from dissent over a period of time. If you go back to, I don't know, under Paul Volcker or the early years of Alan Greenspan, there's quite a lot of dissent. There are disagreements coming through on the FOMC. If you look at the Bank of England, the MPC, I would say all the way through Eddie George's time and Mervin's time, you have still quite a lot of dissent. I mean, famously, you've got the meeting that took place, I think, in 2008, where Tim Besley and Danny Blanchflower voted in completely different directions in terms of where interest rates would be going, as Danny continuously reminds us year after year after year. But the amount of dissent has faded very, very rapidly. And although this year, to be fair, the MPC has shown more signs of dissent, that's been a very, very long time coming. And I think what is very, very striking is that if you go back to that period in, say, 2021, 2022, when you had people outside the institutions talking about the possibility of higher inflation, yeah, I'm very small fry, but in terms of big fry, you had Jason Furman and Larry Summers in the US who were warning about higher inflation in the US long before the FOMC itself properly recognized it. And in the UK, you had Martin Wolf, who unveiled an inner monetarist that I didn't think was there, but nevertheless it did appear in 2021. Roger Bootle, who'd famously written his book, The Death of Inflation, back in 1996, who's now talking about the resurrection of inflation. And Andy Haldane, of course, who in sort of a valedictory speech at the Bank of England before he left, was writing about the possibility of inflationary pressures rising. So there were people there, but none of them were on the committee. And there's a section in the book, I sort of go through a series of quotes through 2020 and 2021 from people who were on the MPC or on the FOMC. And it's remarkable how every single time there's a hint of inflation, it's dismissed. It's just not relevant. Every single time the argument is always in favor of some kind of deflationary outcome. And one of the people on the MPC who actually had a hawkish reputation was saying, well, I'll believe the inflation if and when I see it, but it's not going to happen. So why? Well, this is where it gets slightly more controversial, I think. I do wonder whether the appointments process for the MPC needs to be re-examined a little bit. I mean, this is an issue about corporate governance more than anything else. But first of all, the MPC has 4 deputy governors. I think all 4 at some point spent some time in the Treasury. 2 of them, of course, came directly from the Treasury. 1 was in charge of external appointments to the MPC at the Treasury. Another economist who was an external MPC member has been on the interviewing panel for MPC members on every single panel, I think, since at least 2011, not mentioning any names, you know who I'm talking about. And each of these people is doing nothing wrong. I stress this. It's not the individuals who are at fault. I think that if you think about corporate governance, making sure you get a range of different ideas and different skill bases and different perspectives coming through, I think there's a danger that if your corporate governance is not sufficiently flexible, you may find that you get an increasing element of groupthink coming through on the committee. So this is not to criticize any individual member of the committee or the fact they're deserving or not deserving of being there. It's much more to say, I'm not convinced that the process that people have to go through is guaranteed to give you the mix that you need.
Right.
I also
Danny Blanchflower as well, maybe.
Well, Danny's one example. Yeah, I mean, there are plenty of others, aren't there? But I suppose the other thing I would note is that, this is even more controversial perhaps, but the person chairing the committee, that people have different perspectives as to what the committee should be delivering. So one person might say, I want the committee to demonstrate a mixture of views, and I want the committee to vote in different ways at different meetings to give the market an idea of where the debate is going. So I like the idea of hawks, doves, people in between. Another person might say, no, I want unanimity, particularly if you've got things like forward guidance, you probably need unanimity. So I'm not mentioning any names, but I can certainly think of 2 governors of the bank that might have one consecutively followed from the other, who might have slightly different views to how the committee itself should be run. So it's not just the members of the committee, it's also how the committee is run, what's expected to deliver, which may be an issue. All I'm saying really is that at a time when inflation was surprising on the upside, in 2021 in particular, it was, I think, certainly with hindsight, but also given some of the views emerging from outside the banks at the time, it was surprising that there was no discussion at all about the possibility of inflation being a problem.
Interesting. Okay, well, look, we'll come back to that, because I think it is suitably controversial and interesting. But let's take a step back, because there is a lot of interesting, I think, monetary and financial history in the book as well. We're talking about inflation, big picture. One of the themes that I really enjoyed or was really engaged by was, well, first of all, you say money matters. Clearly, money matters.
It's a controversial view these days.
Well,
I think,
absolutely,
but,
but also, I think you frequently mention that inflation is a monetary phenomenon that's a tautological statement.
Yes.
You're as interested in the drivers of money demand as
Yes.
you are of money supply, and in particular, you link the former of velocity to issues like trust,
Yes.
broadly speaking, or political economy broadly defined. Can you talk about that a little bit and talk about the relationship between money and prices historically?
Yeah. So there are a series of episodes described in the book, one of which is inflation under the Roman Empire between roughly the birth of Christ in 300 AD, where the price level rises of about 20,000% over that period, which admittedly is not huge each and every year, and then compounding gives you this very, very large number. But nevertheless, there was a process underway, effectively, of creating more money. I mean, this was, currency debasement. So denarii, which were the sort of silver coins back in the day, were the silver content fell dramatically over that 300-year period. So effectively, just producing more and more of the stuff, and it was losing value. And the reason why successive emperors were doing this was because the empire was being attacked in all sorts of different directions, and you needed to have an army. You had to pay to defend yourselves, and of course, they didn't want to raise taxes too much or deliver too much in the way of austerities. You just print money instead, which is another demonstration, in one sense, that monetary and fiscal policy are not quite as separate as perhaps we'd like them to be. But that's a sort of, I would say, a monetary-induced story.
Right.
There's quite a big debate about the 16th century, the so-called price revolution, as to whether it's purely a money-driven story, which is basically the Spanish sailing to the New World, discovering a mountain full of silver in Bolivia and shipping it back to Europe. And there are different debates and so on about what's going on there. But nevertheless, I would say that there's certainly some reasonably compelling evidence that money mattered back then. And then you get to the French Revolution. In the French Revolution, one of the big problems during the revolution was that anyone who could took their precious coins out of the country. I mean, not surprising, given you didn't know exactly how people in the country were going to behave towards you, particularly if you happen to be an aristocrat. Actually, you did know how they're going to behave. You're going to lose your head. But the point is that if you could get your money out, you would get your money out. You get yourself out as well, of course. Then the problem was, well, what are you going to replace this money with? Because the money's disappearing, and they'll produce something. So this was a very early experiment of paper money, these so-called assignats, which were effectively linked to property, because property from the Catholic Church had been seized by the revolutionaries. So you were basically trying to create these new pieces of paper that were valued according to real things, supposedly, a bit like subprime mortgages or something like that. Anyway, the problem then happens that these notes are too big a denomination for the majority of people to use. So you have to produce smaller denomination notes, which are not produced by the central government. They're produced mostly by local councils, mayors, local businesses. Of course, the problem with this is you can just counterfeit this like crazy. So there's loads of the stuff being counterfeited, and you get to the point, and I think there's a huge hyperinflation during this period, but you get to the point where you're thinking, is the hyperinflation a consequence of the money being printed, which is one aspect of the story, and is it partly a consequence of people losing faith in the money itself, simply refusing to accept it or getting rid of it as soon as you get it? You want to get rid of it as fast as possible. So basically, the velocity of circulation is rising very quickly. And actually, I would suggest that quite a lot of hyperinflations that we witness subsequently, they're not just about the idea of a central bank churning out money. They're more to do with the fact that the public lose faith in their monetary and fiscal masters. And when that happens, you end up with this, tremendous increase in velocity, which itself becomes a sort of self-fulfilling part of an inflationary process. Now, the thing with the French Revolution, I think, is interesting is that there's a bit of a connection with the modern era. I mean, I mentioned subprime. In all seriousness, you had stuff before the global financial crisis that was masquerading as near money. People accepted it as being liquid paper, even though it wasn't officially produced by the central bank itself. But of course, the crisis was partly a crisis about the loss of faith in this stuff. And when QE first starts, it seems to me that what you're trying to do in a very simple sense is replace this no longer trusted private money with newly issued public money, which is trusted. So you're effectively trying to stop a depression from happening by making sure there's enough of this public money circulating to replace the stuff that's been destroyed or has lost value. And then as far as QE itself is concerned, I guess I worry that QE has blurred the distinction between monetary and fiscal policy,
Right.
perhaps more than the central banks themselves intended. And that might be one reason why there's more of a concern about inflation. And the other thing I would say about QE is that I think it has possibly weakened the relationship between how bond markets behave and what happens in terms of inflation. So the way I describe it in the book, one point is that effectively you've got a kind of, your bond market is like a radar system. It's warning you about the possibility of enemy bombing raids. In this case, it's inflation rather than enemy bombing raids. If you did a peace deal with your enemy and you then decided to turn off your radar system, you might then regret it at some point in the future. And I think that QE, in one sense, is a similar kind of problem, that you do QE all the time. You basically abolish the bond market vigilantes, who are the people whose job it was, in one sense, to pre-warn about an inflation problem or a fiscal problem. And once they've disappeared and done something else, your radar system just isn't working very well.
Let's explore that a bit further. I mean, you talk a little bit, well, there's a chapter in the book about the inflationary role of governments.
Yes.
And you talk about temptation that's hard to avoid, and the idea of fiscal dominance. And I love your little analogy of makes sense to people of a certain age, maybe, but of Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor.
So,
right, good.
Yeah,
okay. Maybe
Burton,
update it.
So Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor was one version of the story, but for the modern era, you could use J. Lo and Ben Affleck.
There you go.
So yeah, there's a new version.
There you go. Perfect. Yeah. There you go. Can you tell us a little bit about fiscal dominance, the importance of monetary dominance, and in particular, what that means for the coordination of fiscal and monetary policy? Does it always mean that fiscal policy needs to be in support of where the monetary authority is going?
No, but I think that the monetary authority should be making a judgment on the fiscal authority, not the other way around. You see what I mean? So in other words, the fiscal authority can do something, but it should be aware that there could be consequences for its actions, which are then delivered by the monetary authority. So by all means, have a bigger budget deficit, but know that if you do so, other things equal, the central bank might respond to that by raising interest rates. I mean, the classic example of this is the Bundesbank back in the 1970s and 1980s. You know, the successive German governments were terrified of the Bundesbank because they want to do X, Y, and Z in terms of fiscal policy, but they always knew that there could be a judgment exercised by the Bundesbank. Now, you might say that's surely undemocratic, but this actually raises an interesting question about central banks and their independence. You know, the Bundesbank enjoyed its independence partly because there's a sort of folk memory in Germany of hyperinflation in the early 20s. And therefore, there was a certain sense that the Bundesbank had power, which was more important than the sort of, you know, here today, gone tomorrow type of politician. I'm not sure that is necessarily shared in other countries in quite the same way. Actually, I think the UK might have a slight problem with this. But in terms of Burton and Taylor, just in case you don't know, Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, they met on the set of Antony and Cleopatra in the early 60s. They got married. They were probably the most glamorous Hollywood couple we've ever seen. And unfortunately, Burton had a bit of a drink problem, I think it's fair to say. And it went sort of rather horribly wrong. But anyway, they got married, they got divorced. They got married again, they got divorced again. But importantly, I discovered, that's not that important, but it sort of illustrates the point that just before he died, Burton wrote a final love letter to Elizabeth Taylor. And when she died, allegedly, she took this love letter to her grave. So it's terribly sort of moving in lots of different ways. My point is that when in their relationship, it's either it's on or it's off, it's on or it's off. But actually, it's a bit like monetary and fiscal policy. It's either on or it's off, it's on or it's off. And you think it's completely independent, but then you discover that circumstances change politically where it sort of comes back together again, whether you like it or not. So QE, I think, is an example of this. But more broadly, and this is what sort of comes from the historical lessons, I think, governments eventually get to a point when they begin to run out of fiscal space, that they find it difficult politically to raise taxes any further or to deliver austerity. And what can they do then? They can default, which no government really wants to do, unless you're the US and you've got the debt ceiling coming up. But generally speaking, you don't want to default. You can devalue, which might help you if your foreign creditors have lent you in your currency as opposed to their currency. Well, not everyone's in that sort of space. But ultimately, I think that inflation returns partly because it is the least unpleasant initially of all the unpleasant options. There are no good options, but this might come across politically as being possibly the least bad of a bunch of bad options, at least in the very short run. And of course, the way in which this works is that if you can drive your inflation rate up relative to the level of interest rates, then you move into sort of the world of negative real rates, which typically is a world that rewards the debtor at the expense of the creditor. And as in most countries, the government is typically a very, very large debtor. Then there are significant potential short-run benefits of delivering that kind of outcome. And I suppose in the modern era, the way you could think about this is either that central banks become less independent, or that they're staffed by people who are more sympathetic to the idea of leaving rates lower for longer relative to the inflation rate, or that the central bank is under pressure to at least temporarily suspend its inflation target, which was actually a view that Andy Haldane expressed early this year, which I didn't agree with. There was a slight exchange in the FT. I think Jagda, you wrote a letter in response to that as well, if I recall. Yeah. So yeah. So that idea, but that I think itself is dangerous. The idea you know for definite the reason why inflation is high is because of a series of global supply shocks, and that you just suspend the inflation target, let the whole thing work itself out, then reimpose the inflation target. One would have thought that at the end of that process, the public might be slightly more doubtful about the commitment to the inflation target than was the case initially. So that's a sort of slightly odd argument. And of course, the other argument, which is doing the rounds, is the idea that you would simply raise the inflation target. You would go from 2%, which itself you might say was a fairly arbitrary number at the time, to 3%, 4%, or 5%. But once you start going in that direction, when you've already got very high levels of government debt as a share of GDP, the suspicion at least would exist that this is not being done for necessarily the best of reasons.
And you probably don't do it when inflation is 10%.
Well, actually, so there's another aspect of this, which is that the Federal Reserve introduced its flexible average inflation target in late summer, autumn 2020. And this, of course, was the idea that if you want to defeat deflation, you have to commit to higher future inflation to offset past inflationary undershoot. So over the very long run, you're not getting a permanent increase in debt as a share of GDP as a consequence of real rates being higher than you would like them to be, or bumping into the zero rate bound. Now, if the Fed had introduced that policy framework in, say, 2015, you'd probably shrug your shoulders and think big deal. The problem, I think, with introducing it in 2020 was that you introduce a policy, then suddenly inflation picks up, and you're now unsure as to whether you should accommodate it or not, because you've said we're going to commit to higher future inflation, but then you discover this is the wrong kind of inflation, and you're sort of thinking, oh gosh, this is not quite what we bargained for. So this is where the transitory language changes effectively, because in 2020 the Fed is constantly talking about transitory inflation, and by well, actually, it's in Jackson Hole in 2021. Jay Powell is still using the word transitory, and it's only, I would say, I think in October or November of that year that the word transitory is abolished. It is removed from the lexicon of discussions about inflation in the US. It stays in the UK until last week, but nevertheless, in the US, it's abolished in 2021.
So that's interesting. In a way, that's pretty orthodox. I mean, in a sense, you would love the central bank to be independent, forward-looking, out there saying that we are in charge of getting to the inflation target. But in a way, you're arguing that political realities dictates that the sort of fiscal monetary relationship is always a bit more complicated, and in circumstances like this, that can lead to perceptions, if not the reality, of fiscal dominance.
Yes.
So let's turn to a group that would argue exactly the opposite of that, right? Which is that let's call them the modern monetary theorists. I always
Yes.
say there's only three problems with modern monetary theory. It's
Yeah,
not modern, it's not monetary, and it's not a
yeah.
theory. But I don't want to put words into your mouth. I sensed a certain skepticism that I share.
Yes.
But do you want to say a little bit about the guys who say, well, we can print as much as we like because, you know?
Yes, I can say lots of things about them, not all of which is fit to be published, I think. So modern monetary theory, I think it arrives precisely because inflation has been so low for such a long time. It suddenly looks as though it's credible, because if you haven't got an inflation problem, haven't lived through one for a long period of time, it becomes easier then to claim that actually there's not much you can do in terms of policy to dislodge inflation from this very low rate. You know, if you sort of think about very sort of flat Phillips curve or something, you have lots of changes in demand. There's no impact on inflation at all. You think, well, you know, what's the big deal? So I think that's part of the story. Another part of the story is, of course, that, and this comes back actually to the issue of central bank independence. And MMT person would argue that the central bank is precisely the wrong institution to be thinking about these issues, because these issues involve trade-offs of one kind or another, and you're better off asking politicians to make those decisions than central bankers themselves. Anyway, so what's my problem with MMT? I'm not sure where to start, actually.
We got?
So the first problem is that the regulation of the economy from a cyclical point of view is taken away from the central bank and given to the government of the day. And the problem with that, of course, is that, you know, if I'm arguing in the first place that the governments themselves are in some sense responsible or tempted to create inflation, then giving the responsibility back to governments is a recipe, it seems to me, to be, you know, creating or taking more risk with inflation than we've had for quite a long time. So that's my first point. The second point is that there's a very sort of strange idea that now that inflation's returned, it's returned, but it can have nothing to do with governments, because, you know, MMT people are assuming that governments can't be the source of inflation under any circumstances. So although budget deficits have grown enormously and high levels of government debt have become even higher, this is not the source of inflation. So it's all explained away through Ukraine or the pandemic or whatever, but it's nothing to do with the policies themselves that governments are pursuing. And then you come on to another issue, which is the so-called sectoral balances. So I read Stephanie Kelton's book about the deficit myth.
Well
sorry?
Well done.
Yeah, to be fair, it's had, you know, rave reviews by people on Amazon. I'm not sure who they are, but anyway, it's sold very well, so I can't complain. But nevertheless, the book goes back to sort of Wynne Godley's views, but I would say completely misinterprets what those views are. So there's a big focus on sectoral balances. Yeah. And I think one of the arguments that she uses in the book is to say, look, back in the late 1990s, we had in the bubble period a big buildup of household and corporate borrowing. So their sectoral balances were either much less positive, they should have been, or much more negative than they ideally should be. So this idea was you're accumulating lots and lots of private debt, and this was a bad thing. And her story is to say, well, actually, what we should have done back then is to swap all this borrowing being done by the private sector with borrowing being done by the public sector, which could be spent on all sorts of useful infrastructure projects. So she seems to be suggesting that if you increased government borrowing, this would automatically reduce the borrowing of the corporate sector or the household sector. And yet somehow there is no external sector at all in her model. It doesn't exist. There is no other world out there. And you think, well, surely the consequence of doing this, you're going to end up with a whopping great big balance of payments deficit with all the possible implications that stem from it. Now, to be fair, if you're an American, you might say, well, I don't care about a balance of payments deficit because I have the world's reserve currency. I can get away with borrowing lots and stuff from the rest of the world. But even then, you still have a problem, which is that even if you don't have a balance of payments deficit, if you've got all three domestic sectors in deficit, the chances are that you're going to have even more inflationary problems than you would otherwise have had. So that all seems very peculiar as well. And then more recently, there's a blog that she did, which I was reading
for my research into the book, and she was talking about the fact that in dealing with this latest period of energy price shocks, she was arguing that the first thing we should do is do a peace deal over Ukraine immediately, which I thought was odd because it suggested that your foreign policy or diplomatic policy should be entirely held hostage by a particular domestic economic policy aim. And I refer in the book to the idea that she might have argued this, but when John Maynard Keynes wrote How to Pay for the War, he didn't start off by saying what we need is a peace treaty with Hitler. That wasn't the first message that came to mind. So there we are.
Terrific. Well, look, I'm very conscious of leaving time for questions. I still have a couple more for you though, Stephen.
Okay.
And then we'll move on to the audience if that's okay. So another theme of the book, it seems to me, is that, I mean, the past 20 years, it seems to me, have, and you have clearly affected the mindset of policymakers and economists around the world. You argue that a lot of that is actually down to good fortune rather than the wisdom of policymakers themselves. I wanted you to say a little bit about that, but I also wanted to ask, if we're moving into a world where that is not so much the case going forward, if we're getting a deglobalization to some degree, why is it that you think we will end up with higher inflation as opposed to higher interest rates?
You could end up with both or either. That's certainly true. So first of all, the Great Moderation, I think most of us know what it is, but just to remind you, the Great Moderation was the idea that we moved into an era of reasonable and stable economic growth accompanied by low and stable inflation. Therefore, the kind of nasty upsets that we had previously wouldn't happen quite so often, apart from the global financial crisis, which was somewhat bigger than people might have anticipated. But nevertheless, that was a broad idea. And I would say by the mid-noughties, there was a general view among central banks that they themselves were responsible for this Great Moderation. So one example of this was a speech that Ben Bernanke gave before he became chair of the Fed. And he was describing the Great Moderation purely in sort of monetary policy terms. We've done this is the consequence, it's great. But if you go back to the original authors of the paper that described the Great Moderation, which is Stock and Watson in the US, they argue that actually the Great Moderation was more to do with a series of lucky moments all happening at roughly the same time. So exactly the opposite of the sort of pandemic Ukraine type of story, i.e. series of lucky moments which effectively meant that there was the import of deflationary pressures into particularly the Western economies as a consequence of outsourcing of production to, say, China or services to India or whatever it might be. So it's all fairly familiar. Now, what I would say is that during the period of the Great Moderation, this sort of imported good deflation, as I'd call it, there was the start of an asymmetry in terms of policy, which was that there was such a reluctance to absorb this good deflation in terms of lower inflation domestically, that instead central bankers try to push domestically generated inflation higher to get them back to something approaching target. And the problem with that is effectively, I would say, that real rates were too low, which in turn encouraged a range of asset price bubbles. It wasn't the only reason for the asset price bubbles, but nevertheless, I think it was a contributory factor. Now, if that's true, then if it's also the case now that that Great Moderation is reversing, then you expect slightly different results to come through. Now, the first thing I would note is that there's a lot of emphasis on the pandemic itself. But importantly, I think the sort of reversal of globalization starts long before the pandemic. The pandemic accelerates the process, it turbocharges the process. But the sort of decoupling of the US and China certainly predates the pandemic. The move towards regional trade blocs predates the pandemic. Brexit obviously predates the pandemic. And there's a whole bunch of things that have happened over recent years, which are not helpful for a continuation of the Great Moderation. Now, it is true that when the trading system fell apart in the 1930s, you had deflation rather than inflation. I thought a lot about this, but I think that one obvious explanation for this is, of course, the 1930s was primarily a sort of banking, finance-driven crisis that created deflation anyway. The protectionism that emerged at the same time possibly limited the amount of deflation, but was not something that was going to prevent the deflation from happening. But in the absence of
major sustained banking crisis or collapse in asset prices, it seems to me that what you're doing is you're swapping a deflationary tailwind for an inflationary headwind. Or put another way, for Western policymakers, you have to do more heavy lifting in terms of monetary policy to get you the same inflationary outcome over coming years. Now, you're right, Shamik. I mean, if you were to decide you're absolutely devoted to the low inflation rate and you're going to stick to it, and that's basically saying that your sort of equilibrium nominal rate is going to be higher to reach that number in the future. But the other alternative is to say, well, actually, central banks haven't got the appetite for doing that. And it's too painful in terms of the fiscal outcome, of course, because you're back to the issue of monetary and fiscal policy being blurred. And you're also worried, and this is particularly relevant, obviously, over the last few months with Silicon Valley Bank and so on, you're also worried about the possibility of financial dominance. So what you do in terms of interest rates to secure a low inflation outcome may be inconsistent with what you're doing to secure a stable financial outcome.
Fabulous. Let's my final question then. Let's turn back to central banks. And one thing I love about your books is that they are commendably free of jargon, or certainly not a
That's
single
good to
equation or anything like that. No. One of the things that maybe concerns me a little bit is that there is a pretty standard model, it seems to be, at central banks. The model that we use is pretty uniform across the world. Some people call it the New Keynesian model.
Yeah.
I worry that it's based on three great unknowables, which may not even exist.
Yes.
The natural rate of unemployment,
debatable.
The level of potential output,
debatable.
And the neutral rate of interest,
definitely debatable.
So do you think there's scope, even though you're not dealing in delving into those technicalities, do you think there is scope for a new research, a Lacatosian change in the way that central banks approach these issues and problems? And just to tee you up a little bit, you talk about your 4 tests. Yes. And your 14 lessons. Do you think they could?
I won't go through all of those.
No, but do you think some of them could form the basis of a new way of thinking?
So first of all, I think that the models tend to give the central banks the answers they're looking for. That's the biggest single problem with them, that they tend to sort of revert back to 2% in 2 or 3 years' time, and that to get there, there is an assumed pact with the public, i.e. that central bank is credible, knows what it's doing, will do what's required of it, but that the public understand that that's what the central bank intends to do. And I think this whole debate currently about second round effects, maybe it's an indication the public are thinking, well, actually, my previous sort of rule of thumb was central bank tells me 2% inflation is going to be where it is, therefore I believe them, and that's simple. My new rule of thumb is central banks got it completely wrong 3 years in a row, therefore I'll take current headline inflation as my guide as to where inflation is going to be in the future. Now, these are two fundamentally different ways of thinking about the world. If you model them, you get completely different results. And it comes back to this issue of credibility, effectively. Do the public believe what it is the central bank is doing? So my 4 tests, well, we've done one already, effectively, which is the idea of supply side shocks. I think central banks tend to assume that supply is kind of given and not affected by monetary conditions themselves, which is may or may not be true. But moreover, the debate about what's happening with supply doesn't tend to be uppermost in people's minds. It's all about demand, it's about output gaps, not enough in my view about supply potential and how it might change over time. But if you look back to the 1970s and think, well, why was inflationary problems so much bigger in the UK than in Germany? I think the Germans understood very quickly that the oil price shock was a negative supply hit, and you had to do something about that. Whereas in Britain, I think the view was more that this was a sort of demand problem associated with squeeze of real incomes, and you actually should be supporting demand more than perhaps was wise. And that I mentioned him now, the late Sir Alan Budd, who sadly passed away in January. He read through every chapter of this book last year, and he was really, really great at sort of giving me very wise counsel on what was happening in the 1970s, because he was there. He knew what was happening, and he was marvelous on that. So I think that itself is a problem. Then in terms of the
the sort of the tests. My first test is very simple. Have you got institutional reforms that have happened because you're aiming at fighting another problem? And those institutional reforms have made it more difficult for you then to control inflation when it first appears. So within that bucket, I would certainly include QE as a commitment over a long period of time, and also the flexible average inflation targeting framework.
Or forward guidance.
Or forward guidance. They're all roughly the same kind of bucket of we know what the problem is and discover the problem is something completely different. The second test is it's money supply. And I never thought I'd say this, but I think when you look at what happened to monetary growth in 2020, it was like a red flashing light saying, look, we're not sure quite what's happening here, but this looks actually pretty peculiar. This is off the charts of anything we've seen previously. And the reason why I think it's particularly relevant in 2020 is that, okay, the pandemic is terrible, output is collapsing, and everything looks a bit like the Great Depression Mark II, so to speak. But the big difference is, compared with the Depression, you haven't got multiple bank failures, you haven't got mass bankruptcies, you have a temporary increase in unemployment in the US, but not in Europe because of the furlough scheme, different treatment of people under those circumstances. But there was an absolute determination through fiscal policy to preserve the economic infrastructure, which was totally lacking in the 1930s. So the idea that you needed to sort of pump lots of money in for a 1930s type depression, when in fact you weren't facing that problem, that strikes me as being odd. And you can think of this in one of two ways. Either you say we shouldn't have pumped so much money in the first place, which would be a difficult judgment to make at the time because everything was so awful, or more importantly, more likely, the case for tightening policy earlier and more aggressively was, I think, very clearly there, but it wasn't there in the minds of central bankers because their framework was don't look at money, it's not important anymore, it's credibility that matters. So actually they've damaged their credibility in my view by not looking at that indicator of money. And then my third test is the time machine test, which comes back to central bankers having perfect foresight that they always know what's going to happen in 2 years' time. Because in 2 years' time, we all know that inflation is always going to be at 2%. I think actually there's another institutional issue, which is how do you set about judging the appropriateness of monetary policy at any particular point in time if the central bank effectively is the judge and jury of that policy? Now, you might say, well, it's up to economists elsewhere to question the central bank and impose different kinds of forecasts. If I were to issue a broader lament, it is that economists generally have not done that. Maybe they're all hoping to get a job on the NPC and hate themselves, but I think it is odd that there's been very little questioning of the ability of central banks to get back to 2% when, particularly at the time, the errors have got bigger, the second round effects have got larger. And I think you can take this one or two ways in terms of risk to the future. One, that we will get back to 2% in terms of inflation, but only by doing a lot more monetary heavy lifting than is built into forecasts currently, which itself would be disturbing because there are all sorts of implications for the recession and so on that might come with that. And two, that actually the appetite for delivering that kind of monetary outcome just isn't there, in which case inflation is more embedded than it has been for quite some time. And and then the big question is, how do we think about central bank independence in a year, 2, 3 years' time, if it turns out that inflation is still quite elevated? Because at that point, the public will say, I think quite rightly, well, you had a mandate, you're supposed to deliver on this, and you haven't. So how should we think about you now?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, fantastic. Thank you, Stephen. Let me open up to questions. If you have a question, please just raise your hand and maybe introduce yourself just before you ask it.
There's a microphone there.
From UBS. So I understand your perspective where when it's really bad during the pandemic, there will be like obstacles for central banks to make decisions around controlling inflation. But what I find difficult to understand is before 2020, we had the longest period of economic expansion with historic low unemployment across the developed world. Why did we not have more discussions around withdrawing QE during that period? Because there are very clear indications that we are in the middle of an economic cycle.
Yeah. Well, I think there were people discussing the possibility of getting rid of QE. but they weren't people that were occupying the corridors of the central banks. For one, I mean, I can't speak for everyone, but I was worried about the impact of QE in distorting capital markets. You know, obviously QE was designed to lower you know, government bond yields from where they otherwise would be. The theory was that that would lead to higher valuations for stock markets or corporate bond markets, and the hope was that, you know, if you've got a broken banking system, then you know, companies can raise funds through these alternative sources, which they can then use for investment purposes. Well, that's fine. The problem, however, was that throughout the last period, so between the GFC and the onset of the pandemic, there's very little evidence that investment was picking up in response to what were elevated asset prices. I also think that it may be that listed markets did unusually well for a period of time, which in turn meant that rubbish companies with rubbish productivity, sort of zombie type companies, were able to survive for longer than they otherwise would have done, absorbing more resources than they would have done. And the consequence was that there were fewer startups than there had been for quite some time. So I think the case for thinking about ending QE was there quite early on. I just don't think that central banks themselves necessarily wanted to do it because they were so afraid of a sort of zero rate bound deflationary outcome that, again, it's basically all chips on red. It's all the focus on defeating deflation, whatever happens, even if the deflation could have been possibly a good rather than a bad deflation. So for me, what started off as an emergency measure, QE, to deal with the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis, becomes a semi-permanent measure because the central banks are so terrified of breaching the zero interest rate bound. So it becomes a permanent feature. But I think it has led to a lot of distortions that have actually done quite a lot of damage to the underlying performance of the economy.
And actually, that was pretty clear during the pandemic, wasn't it? I mean, there are arguments about whether it should have been relaunched at all, but it seems to me pretty clear that it went on for too long.
Well, it's I mean, in one sense, pandemic, you're locking the economy down, you're stopping people from spending. So you're doing QE.
Yeah.
I mean, why? Why would you do it then of all times? I mean, because all you're doing basically is lifting the value of financial assets a long way.
Yeah.
So when lockdowns come to an end, the potential spending power of at least some people in society has gone up a long way.
Yeah.
So I mean, this is a sort of velocity argument again, effectively, that money supply then slows down because you've created so much of it during the lockdown period. But you're suddenly able to swap this financial asset increase in values to actual spending.
Yeah, great. Another question here. Again, please introduce yourself.
Forrest Cappy. It strikes me as odd that there are all these explanations for our recent inflation. When you look across a long period of history, there's no inflation, century after century, no inflation to speak of. England's war with France through most of the 18th century, and we've got a general inflation.
Yeah.
The episodes that you get are when you abandon the metallic base and print money. Unfairly, money comes in, expands hugely, and I think supports your fiscal point. Particularly in these episodes, not war, but in civil war.
Yeah.
Where spending rises of necessity and revenue shrink as different parts of the country are opposed. And when fiscal space runs out, as they say, you print money.
Yeah.
And you don't have to numbers for this. You can see it in the diagram, the triangle, and the corresponding inflationary triangle alongside it. So it puzzles me why people are prepared to accept all these excuses. Then the governor, and this takes us to the independence. The governor said that they weren't responsible for 80% of the inflation that we had. I mean, if that's true, why would they wind themselves up?
Yes.
How would they have any credibility beyond that? If they tell us they're going to hit such and such a target, well, there's another 80% that they're not going to be able to touch. So who knows what inflation will do?
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, if you go back over the last, so I looked at the Bank of England's data over the last millennium. There's very good stuff on inflation. Now, whether every single
price index for every single year is accurately measured is another matter altogether. But I would say, broadly speaking, throughout the period from sort of, I don't know, 1200 AD through to 1900, you've got periods of prices going up, periods of prices going down, but the whole thing tends to sort of balance itself out, with the few exceptions, one of which is the price revolution in the 16th century, then both the American and the French revolutions, the American Civil War, and then linked to your point about precious metal, what's striking about the second half of the 19th century, when the international convention is to be on the gold standard or some kind of metallic standard, because you've got the Industrial Revolution, rapid economic growth, but you've got no increase in gold supply, prices then continuously fall. So you have what I would describe as a good deflation during that period. Today, yeah, I mean, I think maybe going back to the 1970s is an interesting example of this to illustrate what's happening today. So and this is going back to Alan Budd's conversations I had last year. So in 1974, actually, can I read a quote from the book? This I think I've asked people who said this. You'll now know it's not who you'd naturally think it is, but this is a quote that I came across, which I absolutely love, because when I read it, I thought this could have been said by Andrew Bailey or by Christine Lagarde or Jerome Powell over the last couple of years. But the words are as follows: to a considerable extent, inflation has been the consequence of costs and prices imported from abroad over which we have no control. And the person went on to say that the consequence of the staggering increase in oil prices at present will be to put up prices in this country, and the consequence of that will be to depress consumer demand. And the implication there was that the squeeze in real incomes by depressing consumer demand will probably push inflation back down again. So what went up went down. And those words came from Anthony Barber, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer in February 1974. In fact, he lost his job in February 1974 because the Tories were booted out and Labour came in. But my point about that is that this idea of saying it's all external, it's got nothing to do with us, it's certainly a feature of central bank independence today, because in one sense you don't want to admit it's your fault because you're independent, you don't want to lose your independence. But at the same time, history is full of examples of where an external shock has been treated as no more than external shock, without the recognition that there are political and social forces at work domestically that can convert an external shock into something which is much more persistent at home. And again, this contrast between Germany and the UK in the mid-1970s is really fascinating, because they have exactly the same external shock in 1973 with the quadrupling of oil prices. But the average German inflation rate in the mid-70s, the 5-year period in 1978, is exactly the same as it was in the 5 years to 1973, whereas the UK number was like just a little bit higher. I mean, horribly higher in the second period. So yeah, I think it is odd that when you've got such a big inflation shock as the kind we've seen recently, that you sort of say nothing to do with us. I think that is not necessarily wise.
The questions?
I think it might be yes. So I'm Felix from Public Leveling Up. I was going to ask, I guess sadly this week Robert Lucas died.
Yes.
But have central banks gone too far with forward guidance? And if not, how can they actually how can they do their job given expectations in markets?
Yes. Well, I'm pleased to say that not that I anticipated his death, because my rational expectations weren't that good, but I'm pleased to say there's a section on Robert Lucas and Tom Sargent in the book. Actually, the one thing I focused on here was less Lucas and more Sargent, with the paper he wrote in the early 80s, which was looking at 4 great sort of hyperinflations and how they were dealt with. So these are hyperinflations in Europe in the sort of interwar period. So it's the Weimar Republic, I think it's the Polish inflation, the Hungarian inflation. Is it Russian, is it? Thank you. I did read it, I promise you, but he's read it better than I have. Anyway, but you know, he reaches this conclusion that says that the way you deal with a hyperinflation is that you create institutions that the public understand will no longer accommodate that inflation. So you change people's expectations for the future by changing the institutions themselves. And so his big thing is independent central bank, legally unable to finance government borrowing. So there's no possibility of any kind of fiscal dominance. and then a commitment on behalf of the government itself to deliver on a debt stabilization or debt reduction program over the course of the next few years. And his argument is that if you do these things, then the change in inflation behavior can be remarkably quick and remarkably effective. And I think, so my criticism of this to a degree is that oddly and perversely, I think it might be easier at times to deal with a hyperinflation than a relatively modest inflation, because hyperinflations are so incredibly toxic that the majority of people will go along with anything to stop them, because you know your social system is breaking down at the rate of knots. With a more modest inflation, I think it's more difficult, A, because you get winners and losers with a modest inflation, you know, the distributional effects that tend to benefit some people in society quite considerably. But secondly, and this is the thing I think that Lucas and Sargent pointed a slight problem with, it's the idea of the possibility of the U-turn. You commit to a policy, but the public don't believe you and expect you to change your mind. And if they expect you to change your mind, then the costs of trying to impose that policy become a lot greater. So, you know, under Thatcher in the early 80s, 1981, you had this debate about, you know, the U-turn. And you know, she gave this famous speech in the Conservative Party conference saying that you turn if you want to, but the lady's not turning. And you know, I'm not sure she was an expert on Lucas and Sargent, but in one sense, she was trying to make a commitment to that kind of idea. But my problem, I think, is this: that if you think there are a series of political compromises that are being made that may not be sustainable, and even if your policy appears to be credible, it is potentially undone by the public's doubt about whether you're going to stick with it through thick and thin. Now, I think there's actually an odd problem for central banks today, which is that for the Bank of England, it became independent in 1997. It's never had to worry about inflation really since then, until now. So what we don't know is how an independent central bank that doesn't have direct political legitimacy, in the sense it can put itself out for re-election, can it impose the kinds of costs on society that were imposed during earlier periods when inflation was a much bigger problem? And I don't know what the answer is, but this is another conversation I had with another policymaker who was around in the 70s and 80s about independent central banks. And the point I make, I suppose, is that imagine a thought experiment. The Bank of England becomes independent in 1980 rather than 1987. Is required to get rid of inflation. Let's say there's an inflation target given to it by Parliament, 2% for argument's sake. It says, get on with it, be there in 3 or 4 years' time. Now, even if the Bank of England was completely credible relative to, say, an elected government, the amount of pain, I suspect, the economy would have to go through to deliver on an outcome would have been so great that the central bank's independence would have disappeared as fast as it had been given. So I think there are limits as to what you can deliver in these particular circumstances.
It's a bit like what happened in New Zealand.
Over which period?
After granting a Reserve Bank independence.
Which was late 1980s, wasn't it, in New Zealand's case, if I recall?
Yes,
yeah. But inflation, I think, was quite low by that stage in New Zealand.
Well, it was high enough that there was the point of it was to bring it down.
Yes, but it wasn't high like it was in the UK in 1980. I mean, look, I accept that it may work in certain circumstances, but I think that when you got inflation up at sort of, what was it, 15, 17% in 1980, something like that, and unemployment was going up at the rate of knots, I think in those circumstances it's potentially tricky. I don't know what the answer is, but I'm just saying that if a central bank is faced with a high persistent inflation problem, is it quite so easy to get rid of it as would have been the case in other circumstances? Or put another way, another example from the book actually, which is that the Federal Reserve under Volcker was independent, the Federal Reserve under Arthur F. Burns was independent, but the outcomes in terms of inflation were fundamentally different.
I think we maybe have time for one more, is that right? One over there.
Hello, Jen Castle, Oxford University. Has inflation targeting had its day? And if so, what would you replace it with?
Oh gosh. So inflation targeting has an obvious problem. And I think the history of this is quite well worth thinking about, which is that, back in the day, back when Shamik and myself were masters of the universe at the Treasury in the mid-1980s, we had all these things called intermediate targets. And you had intermediate targets for a reason, which is you knew you couldn't observe inflation in a year or 2 years' time. So you had something that you believed was connected loosely with that inflationary outcome, and that's the thing you controlled.
and you hope by controlling that thing, you then get your right inflation outcome, down the road. And so, you had money supply targeting, which didn't work. And then you had exchange rate targeting, which didn't work. So you sort of gradually abandoned all these other options, and you eventually end up with inflation targeting because all the intermediate targets didn't really work terribly well. The problem, I think, with inflation targeting is that, first of all, the timing issue, the gap between what you're doing today and where you might be in terms of inflation in 2 or 3 years' time. But secondly, I think the way in which it's being modeled is the accident of the modeling has come from the fact that because inflation has been so well behaved for such a long period of time, the models are constructed basically to say it'll continue. And if it turns out that it doesn't continue, then either you end up abandoning inflation targeting, well, I have no idea what you replace it with, maybe there's nominal GDP targeting or something like that, but I don't think that's any better. Or you have to have a complete rethink as to how you forecast future inflation. And I would suggest that would require more emphasis on money than we've seen in recent years, less emphasis on the idea that credibility is there for all time and can't possibly go wrong. And also, I would suggest from a sort of social political point of view, much more focus on the possibility of persistent second round effects.
More rules, more explicit rules.
Well, maybe. I mean, one thing that I think is odd is that, again, think about the last 2 or 3 years, particularly in the UK, inflation surprises on the upside more and more and more, and nothing happens. And I think that the central bank, but this is a very sort of straightforward metaphor, I suppose. I think a central bank is a bit like a referee on the football pitch. They're not there to play the game. That's for us to do. But they are there to tell you that there are consequences of behavior of a certain kind. So you could think about interest rate increases being sort of yellow and red cards. They're sort of indications that if you behave in a certain way, there are consequences. My concern in one sense over the last 2 or 3 years is that for too long, there were no consequences. I think monetary policy should work on the basis that the public expect a certain kind of behavior in response to a certain kind of inflation outcome. And if the behavior doesn't actually come through, then I think the public quite rightly will say, well, we're not sure that you are committed to your target in the way that you claimed to be in the past. And therefore, we don't think you're as credible as you once were. Now, and the final thing I'll say on this actually is that the whole industry of expectations, personally, I think it's an awful lot of wasted resource. It's a terrible thing to say, but I think that inflation expectations are much more a lagging indicator than they actually should be. So this is back to sort of Robert Lucas and so on. But I really do think that if you've had a long period of low stable inflation, expectations will stay low for longer than people's actual inflation behavior remains well behaved. So I think the evidence from earlier periods is that to the extent we have measures of inflation expectations, they're very, very rudimentary, of course, if at all, in previous episodes. What tends to happen is the expectations pick up long after the actual inflation has risen. So I looked at the late 60s, early 70s. Of course, there's no obvious measures of inflation expectations in financial markets, but you have got rudimentary sort of blue chip forecasts or equivalent consensus forecasts. And what is striking about the late 60s, early 70s, although we now know historically this was the big inflationary moment, it wasn't forecast. There was no hint of that in the forecasts themselves. So there's a rather good paper, which some of you know who wrote it. The Federal Reserve guy 2 years ago on the expectations. You know what it's called? Yeah. It's referred to in the book. I just can't remember the title of it. It's a good read. It's a lot of fun. I mean, it's quite technical for me, because I'm not a very technical economist, but it's quite good fun in terms of thinking about, do expectations really matter? Or do they matter as much as central banks themselves tend to think?
So, well, look, let's bring it to a close there. All that's left for me to say is thank you, Stephen. It's a great book. I would encourage you to read it. I think books like this, books like Jagjit's on money minders, they can replace, frankly, quite a lot of the sort of dry technical stuff that we do get exposed to. I think they deal with bigger issues in a more engaging way. And for that, thank you very much, Stephen.